Hello, and welcome to Breast Cancer Conversations, a podcast brought to you by SurvivingBreastCancer.org. I am Laura Carfing, breast cancer survivor and founder of SurvivingBreastCancer.org, a nonprofit organization providing community, education, and resources to empower those diagnosed with breast cancer and their caregivers from day one and beyond. Hello, my friends. I am so excited you are joining us today for another episode of Breast Cancer Conversations. If you are new to the podcast, welcome. If you are returning, thank you so much for tuning in week after week. I am so glad you are here. Each week, we bring you the hottest topics coming from professionals in the field, those living with breast cancer, and so much more. Today, we have a really special episode for you. I am excited to be joined by co-founders Brad Carver and Jim Shanahan and colleague Peter Cornelius from Endeavorex. You may recognize their names because they were on the podcast a couple of weeks ago and helped us understand this new term called Metabooncology. We learned about all things about metabolic health, insulin, and so much more. It was kind of like a little science class, to be honest. But today we're actually going to be talking about clinical trials. And so this is where it gets really exciting because never before have we had people on the podcast talk from the vantage point of actually developing the clinical trial. I think that's just so cool. So in addition to that, we are going to be discussing clinical trials for TNBC, this particular trial, the Amelia-1 trial for people who are living with metastatic disease and are on Piqray, plus so much more. So I really hope you enjoy. Let's get started.
Just like immune oncology showed that you can leverage the host, the other systemic, the non-cancer aspects of
the patient's immune system,
the patient's own immune system, the patient's metabolic health is equally important.
That is such a great comparison because I'm familiar with immuno-oncology, that is, using the person's own immune system to recognize and destroy cancer cells more effectively. Metabooncology is a burgeoning field. I am optimistic and excited that you all at Endeavorex are developing clinical studies to test this hypothesis.
Patients who come onto that therapy, Piqray plus fulvestrant, if they have insulin resistance at baseline, they tend to do worse in terms of their metabolic status.
Welcome to the conversation.
We've got two clinical studies that we're opening up right now. One of them is a collaboration with Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York City. So they've got 5 sites in New York City. That is looking at triple-negative breast cancer patients who have this insulin resistance at baseline. And the hypothesis and what we know from previous studies that others have done and scientific studies, they show that triple-negative breast cancer patients who have this insulin resistance at baseline tend to have more aggressive cancer, and it tends to grow faster. They don't respond to treatment as well, and they progress to the next line and the next line and the next line very, very quickly. So that's one study that we're opening up right now, and that's with Dr. Neil Iyengar.
And can you tell me a little bit more about Dr. Iyengar?
So Dr. Iyengar is a breast cancer researcher at Memorial Sloan Kettering, is very particular because he looks at and has been studying this intersection between metabolic dysfunction and breast cancer for quite some time now. He approached us and asked us if we would be willing to collaborate with him on this study. And we said, of course. And because this is his area of research, it's our area of research, and we think this is a terrific match. And of course, Memorial Sloan Kettering is an excellent, not only hospital, but research facility. We're very excited about that study. We think if we demonstrate that our drug in combination, in this case with eribulin, for second and third line, for patients that have baseline insulin resistance, by showing that we can improve the insulin resistance, eribulin is going to work a whole lot better. Now, our drug should work and have more benefits, as Brad was suggesting, on top of just the insulin resistance. This really should prove out the hypothesis that helping to improve these metabolic hormones is going to have a profound effect on improving the lives of the cancer patients themselves, in this case, triple-negative breast cancer.
That's just so exciting. Such great work. And we'll be sure to link to Dr. Iyengar's trial in the show notes as well as on our SurvivingBreastCancer.org website. And I love how you're bringing in metabolism into the oncology space. That's brilliant.
One of our early advisors, Andy Dannenberg, coined the term metabooncology as sort of a riff on the area of immuno-oncology, the concept that your immune system can be leveraged to attack the cancer. We were talking about metabooncology is the concept that your metabolic systems, your endocrine metabolic systems may drive or accelerate cancer growth, and they could be attenuated and lead to better outcomes. So this metabolo-oncology space is what Andy called it, and what we call it. We call ourselves the metabolo-oncology company. And Neil Iyengar is he's working in the metabolo-oncology space, and he's a breast medical oncologist. He's run clinical trials before, and he's really excited to launch this trial that he's sponsoring, because it will begin to allow him to test our compound as a way to really treat patients, give patients better options.
I mean, this is music to my ears, honestly, because, it's clearly patient-centric, trying to help the patient respond and have even better positive outcomes. And not just with the cancer, but the whole metabolic person as a whole, right? So again, as I started off this conversation with my little whack-a-mole example of problem after problem, there's really an opportunity here to mitigate and decrease those longer-term effects that might be bubbling up later on. So compliments to your work that you guys are doing and really paving the way in this space. It's really exciting news.
We've discussed the issue of science vastly outpacing standard of care. And I was just so enthused by that. And I know that our breast cancer community in general is very, very enthusiastic about these kinds of results. And they can learn from scientists. And from that perspective, I would just ask that you describe a typical day in the life of you as scientists, and also what would trigger you with regards to your investigations to decide to stop going down a particular path and following a new path.
Peter, as the scientist, why don't you kick us off?
We should say Syndavrix is a virtual biotech company, and that's a fairly common model these days in biotech. And what that means is that we don't have bricks and mortar wet lab space to our own. We have offices, and the work that gets done is using contract research organizations, or CROs. And so everything, and it's actually, you may think this is shocking or strange that, you don't have a lab? I don't go into the lab every day? It's like, no, the model, works because there's been this whole increase in availability of companies whose mission is to support drug discovery and drug development. So every single aspect of drug discovery, from the earliest chemistry experiments to animal studies, to toxicology, safety studies, to clinical trials, it all can be contracted out. And so that's our model. So, in terms of a typical day, no, I'm not. I'm actually not going into the lab. But sometimes I'm going to the lab, as I was yesterday, of a CRO that we work closely with here in the Boston area. When you rely on CROs to do the work, you have to have a very good relationship with them. And so typically my day will involve, most of the day at some level, interactions with CROs or with our internal team. And we have an internal team, which is very small in terms of full-time employees of Syndavrix. But we have the next circle, the outer circle, is a number of consultants spanning the entire realm of drug development, right? With whom we've worked, some of them for many years, very closely, and we have very good relationships with them. And so some of the clinical operations manager, the clinical trial responsible person, the MD, these are people who work with our phase one, some of whom Brad worked with in his previous company, and we're going to continue to work with them in our next trial as well, the one that we are sponsoring, which we haven't talked about yet. So my day is working closely with CROs, working closely with Brad and Jim and the other internal team members, working with the external team members and the CROs that are managing our clinical trials, trying to stay up with the literature, which is difficult because
there's a lot.
Not only just that there's a lot, and I'm, again, as I said, relatively new to oncology, reading sort of the metabolic side and the oncology side, and then the area of metabolo-oncology is a bit smaller, so that makes it a little bit easier, but it's growing rapidly.
More and more people are beginning to realize the effect of systemic metabolic dysfunction on cancer and cancer progression. We're finding that, at least from my perspective, and Brad and I talk about this a lot, is it seems the endocrinology people, the people who study the metabolic side of things, know more about the cancer than the cancer people know about the metabolic stuff. And it seems from the endocrinology folks are pushing into the oncology side of things, which is the exact opposite of what we thought. Originally, when we first said, metabolo-oncology, this looks like a big thing, we thought the oncology people would be really interested in what's happening on the metabolic side. And so far, we're finding there's a lot of resistance that they don't know about it. If you're a typical cancer researcher and you got your PhD in cancer research, cancer is a cell with a mutation, and that's cancer.
Yeah, you're in your lane, right? Like, this is just what you do.
What's hilarious about immuno-oncology is it had been around for a long time, and everybody dismissed it until somebody did the clinical study and they showed that it worked, and then everybody had to be involved in immuno-oncology. And now it's a $50-60 billion a year mini industry unto itself.
A couple of things. One is that it shows you can leverage the host. You're not targeting the cancer cell necessarily directly, but the ability of the cancer to evade and hide from the body's own immune system, which is this concept that cancer doesn't exist in a vacuum. And we're of that mindset as well. For example, in triple negative breast cancer, the new sacituzumab govitecan, which is an antibody drug conjugate, where a toxic chemo is attached to an antibody, and the antibody is designed to go after a protein on the surface of the cancer.
Just like immune oncology showed that you can leverage the host, the other systemic, the non-cancer aspects of
the patient's immune system,
the patient's own immune system, the patient's metabolic health is equally important. And there's been some very, very interesting work that just came out over the last couple of years coming out of Harvard biology labs. And that was Professor Lynch has been looking at this intersection of metabolic health and the tumor. And she's looking at it from how the immune system and cancer cells fight over energy, glucose and lipids. And with the cancer cells winning the battle mostly, so they're taking up the lipids, they're taking up the glucose, and they're leaving the immune system bereft of any energy. So it kind of goes into shutdown mode. So your immune system turns off because the cancer is eating all of the goodies. That work that she's just shown, I think.
Also, Marcia Higas, H-A-I-G-I-S, Marcia Higas, also at Harvard, is worked on similar areas as well. So that's another burgeoning area in the metabolo-oncology space. It's the effects on the immune system itself.
The tumor cell is very smart, very hard to control, and it's basically hijacking the energy system that other cells in the body want, which is what allows it to grow. It's figured out how to hijack the energy system.
Tumor cells grow faster than most of the cells in your body, which is part of the definition of cancer, right? This thing is this alien is taking over your body from the inside out. And in order to grow and multiply faster, they need more energy. So they do a few things in order to get that energy. One is they send out these signals for blood vessels to come into them. So if you've ever seen pictures of a tumor, they tend to be kind of gross and bloody. Well, that's because it's called vascularization. So the blood vessels, the vascular network, sort of surrounds the tumor to feed it. It tends to be disrupted, tortured, and it's pretty messy. That was Dr. Judah Folkman who showed that. And there's a very interesting story behind how that all happened, but we'll save that for another time. So that's one thing that they do. The other thing they do is they co-opt the energy. They need all of that energy. So sugar and lipids become the preferred fuel. And so they start sucking up all of the lipids and all of the glucose.
Lipids being fat.
Lipids being fat. So we when we talk to people, we say, sugar is bad. And we all know sugar is bad.
Yeah, we hear that a lot too. And one of the questions we get, and we've been talking with a lot of nutritionists, is to kind of debunk some of those myths and, how diet plays such a big role in, while you're going through treatment and then, survivorship and, what you can be feeding and fueling your body with. But it sounds like at the end of the day, it's, eating right, limiting the sugar, the alcohol, and then exercising, right? So that way you could reduce the fat. So that way your cancer can't be clamoring to those lipids and those fat cells.
I'm glad you mentioned exercise because it's a really important aspect. There's Lee Jones also at Memorial Sloan Kettering and Professor Katie Schmitz. So she's over at Penn State. The two of them are really leaders in this idea of weightlifting and resistance training in order to improve clinical outcomes. And they've both done clinical studies in breast cancer patients. And they've shown that not aerobic, not running, not bikes or bicycles or cycling, that doesn't seem to have much of an effect. But weightlifting, resistance training has a profound effect on how patients respond to treatment. And they show that they can withstand treatment longer at higher doses with fewer side effects and with better outcomes.
Muscle health is very important for a number of reasons. And I think that the results from the work that they have done speaks to that.
Yep.
And on the epidemiology side, poor muscle health, low muscle mass, which I think we mentioned before, called sarcopenia, low muscle mass combined with high fat mass, which is called sarcopenic obesity, from an epidemiological standpoint, is associated with poor outcomes in cancer, a variety of cancers. I think including in breast cancer. So again, it speaks to if you can at least maintain or even build some muscle mass, that could help.
Yeah. I think circling back to your question just a few minutes ago about what is our typical day like.
Yes, of course. I love the day in the life. You guys are obviously incredibly busy and working on some really exciting developments.
One of the things that is consuming a lot of our time is the initiation of a clinical study. And so we have a CRO, which is called TD2, that will manage the study for us. And as Peter mentioned, we have a team of people, a team of experts that are consultants, focusing on every aspect of drug development that are required to open a clinical study. And so our primary focus on the research and clinical side is getting another study open. So we talked about the study at Memorial Sloan Kettering with Dr. Neil Iyengar, and that's in triple negative breast cancer with chemotherapy. The second study that we're working on right now and talking to clinical sites, identifying clinical sites, because our focus is to get those sites open as soon as possible and get the study started as soon as possible so we can start to hopefully provide benefit to patients that are HR positive, HER2 negative, and patients that have progressed on the standard of care in first-line metastatic disease, which is a CDK4/6 inhibitor and an aromatase inhibitor. So if a patient progresses on that treatment to the second-line setting, and if they have a PIK3CA mutation, they are eligible to go on a drug called alpelisib or Piqray. And this study that we're alpelisib or Piqray plus fulvestrant. And this study is designed as a triplet therapy where we're taking the standard of care, which is Piqray plus fulvestrant, and adding our drug, iveximostat, or SDX7320, to that treatment regimen. So it'll be a triplet treatment. We're focused, we're spending a majority of our time getting that study up and running and looking at sites across the country in the US so we can start enrolling patients. It's a very exciting study, and because the drug Piqray, one of the side effects of Piqray is hyperglycemia. And a large number of patients that go on Piqray have hyperglycemia, and many of those patients have grade 3, grade 4 hyperglycemia. And that's followed by hyperinsulinemia. And you remember we've been talking a lot today about insulin levels, and insulin being a very bad actor. And Piqray induces insulin resistance and increases insulin levels. So we're trying to correct that.
Yeah. So Piqray basically gives the patient type 2 diabetes.
Yes. While the drug is on board, and one of the scientists who discovered the pathway that Piqray inhibits, his name is Lou Cantley, he basically said, some time ago when Novartis was developing Piqray, that, if you don't have hyperglycemia, then, the drug's not on board. Now, that's a pretty bold statement. It's not true for everyone, because people who are very sensitive to insulin, and so their metabolic health is excellent, they may not experience such awful and very high blood glucose levels, leading to a variety of consequences and drug holidays and dose reductions, et cetera. But I think what's come out and what's ironically our hypothesis from a couple of years ago is now being borne out, is that patients who come onto that therapy, Piqray plus fulvestrant, if they have insulin resistance at baseline, they tend to do worse in terms of their metabolic status. And they are the ones who are most likely to have the grade 3, grade 4 hyperglycemia that, the oncologists are learning how to deal with that. And oncologists, they have forgotten their endocrinology from back in medical school. So then they have to bring in an endocrinologist as your patient's consulting and monitoring and potential dose reductions and dose holidays.
The problem, as the oncologists and some of the patients have told us, is that they've got the mutation. It's very common. It's about 40% of patients have this PIK3CA mutation. Most patients eventually, after first line, will progress to second line. So there's a significant number of patients that have this combination. But what they've told us is that if they're insulin resistant, and many of them are, at baseline, their blood sugar spikes. They go to the hospital. They give them insulin, right? And we know insulin's bad, but that's what they're given. Or they're given a drug called metformin, which is an anti-diabetic drug. And then they've got GI problems because of metformin. Or they give them a drug called an SGLT2. So Farxiga is a brand name of one of those drugs. And those are good for helping to reduce the hyperglycemia, but it doesn't do anything on the insulin or these other pathways that are involved. So, and then the other risk with the SGLT2s, of course, is you're peeing out a lot of sugar, and now you're at high risk for getting a urinary tract infection. So, yay, there's that. So we're hoping that our drug, because our drug is insulin sensitizing, and we know the patients that are baseline insulin sensitive do the best, we think that putting our drug up first and then coming on behind it with the Piqray is going to make these patients respond better with fewer side effects. And we've shown that our drug and Piqray together synergize on the anti-tumor side of things. So we think that it's a real win-win, both on the safety side, on the reducing the complications. You don't have to go see an endocrinologist now, hopefully, and that you see better outcomes on the cancer side.
And so tell me more about your phase 1 clinical study.
In our phase 1 clinical study in cancer patients, and those patients that came into the study that were pre-diabetic, so their baseline insulin levels were high, we were able to show in those patients that we could reduce those insulin levels by about 70+%. So that's number one. So we showed that in cancer patients. In addition to that, in a mouse model, with our drug in combination with alpelisib or Piqray, we showed that we could control, we could significantly reduce the glucose spike that was caused by Piqray, and we prevented the increase in the insulin. So with Piqray on board, in those animal models or alpelisib, we could show that we could control the effects of that drug. And then in a breast cancer tumor model, the MCF7, a different model, we showed in this MCF7 tumor model that our drug together with alpelisib are synergistic from a tumor control perspective. Yeah. So we think all this data it lines up very nicely and suggests that we may have the ability to improve patient outcomes by, number one, allowing Piqray and the combination with fulvestrant, but allowing that drug Piqray to perform better, to perform at its maximum potential, because we're taking care of the feedback loop, the insulin spike, the glucose spike, and that insulin feedback loop that causes alpelisib or Piqray to fail.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is, again, like full circle, right? Where we're really helping the patient. We are solving a problem of the side effects that come with the drugs that we need to be on for survival. And so I just think it is amazing. And I really want to point out in this, video and podcast that we're talking to the faces behind the clinical trial. Like, how amazing is that? Because a lot of times we think, oh, how do we get into a clinical trial? There are these big, scary things that you go on to, clinicaltrial.gov. There's a lot of paperwork behind it. You don't know if it's going to be good or bad. I don't know. There's a lot of misconceptions around clinical trials. And so I just really wanted to highlight and talk about what goes into developing this trial. The one that you guys are producing, is this a phase 2 or phase 3? And then what could someone expect when they're on a trial? I know a lot of times we advocate that you're getting even better care than you would otherwise, because people always want to make sure that you're responding well to whatever it is that they're testing. You get a lot of attention, et cetera. But I would just love to hear from your end, kind of taking us behind the scenes, if you will, on, what goes into developing this clinical trial. I know we talked a lot about the development of the drug itself, but now, this next phase.
So I'd say that we went about this a little bit differently than most people in the industry. We started by talking to the doctors about the problems. And it was Dr. Hope Rugo who told us that this combination of Piqray and insulin-resistant patients seemed to not be the better performers. And she had published some papers on this. And so we had conversations with Dr. Rugo and Dr. O'Shaughnessy and Dr. Iyengar and other breast cancer, Dr. Pustai over at Yale, among others, Joe Sperano, who's over at Mount Sinai now. And they all told us basically the same thing, that their patients were having problems and that it was a very complicated drug. Piqray was a very complicated drug to give because of the endocrinologist. You got to bring in another doctor. The patient is now only not seeing just the oncologist, but now an endocrinologist, and drug interruptions and holidays and dose changes and on and on and on. But what caught our attention was this fact that it causes type 2 diabetes. We knew that our drug had this anti-diabetic effect. So it was the publication by Dr. Cantley who kind of brought the problem to our attention. We said, our drug has these properties. We wonder if we go in combination, would that work? We talked to the doctors and we said, how much of a problem is this? And they said, oh yeah, this is a very big problem, not only for the patients, but for the doctors as well. It's very complicated for the doctors. Now they're playing quarterback and there's another player on board, right, that they have to manage. So it's very complicated from everyone's perspective. So we saw the problem. We thought we had a potential solution, and when we ran those experiments that Peter was in charge of conducting those experiments. But that's when we ran those experiments to see if we could prevent that hyperglycemia, and we showed that we could. So then from there, you develop a protocol. You identify which patients, how are you going to give it, and that's a very complex process in and of itself. You submit to the FDA. The FDA gives you thumbs up or thumbs down, or they may ask some questions. And they've asked us questions and asked us to fine tune this and that, and we've done that, which is then you're ready to open up your study. All right, then you engage one of these clinical research organizations like TD2, in this case, a company we've had about a 12-year relationship with now. So they know us, they know the drug, so that we think of them as part of our team. Now we identify sites all across the country. We think are good sites and good investigators and doctors who might find this of particular interest because of their own research, and there's a lot of them. So then we reach out to all of those doctors. If they're interested, we share the protocol. We do feasibility studies, make sure that there are no other competing studies, that they've got enough patients that they feel that they can contribute materially to the study. Then we have to deal with drug shipment. We've got to make the drug, which is a whole thing. But now we've got to have it shipped, and it's got to be recorded. And this is all under very, very tight scrutiny by the FDA. We've got to maintain records under very, very strict confidentiality. So there's a big database. That's very complex systems in and of itself, because it's blind to us. We never know who the patients are. We're not allowed to. But to your point earlier, we said, how does this benefit the patient? Well, the patient gets excellent care. Right. I mean, above and beyond. They are paid incredibly close attention to. In our case, we even know that we've asked patients to come back to do some extra things. So we want to know if our drug is on board and how our drug is behaving in the body. So we have to take extra blood samples. So in order to accommodate the patient, if they need to come back to the hospital for extra blood draws, we pay for parking, we pay for transportation. Laura, in fact, that was something that you thought would be helpful. So we wrote that right in.
Thank you.
That was good.
No, of course. And I think that's also the other exciting piece about this partnership, right? Is where you're really engaging, in this example, like survivingbreastcancer.org and nonprofit organizations and patient advocacy groups to inform your study as well. So it's really this great combination of, science, oncologist, and the person who's benefiting from this. So it's amazing. It's a great triangle.
Talking to the patients, I mean, how it just blows our mind that somebody could be developing a drug and not talk to the patients. I mean, how is that even possible?
Right. Scary how often that happens. So again, that's just one thing I really wanted to highlight to everyone, is that this opportunity to be speaking with the three of you and talking about, very complex terms and understanding the human body. Like I said, I do not have the science background, and being able to share that in layman's terms that is understandable and really making us as the patient feel comfortable about what we're dealing with, not just the cancer, but all of the longer term side effects as well. So how would someone find out more about getting involved in this trial? Let's say someone is on Piqray and they're interested in finding out more. What would their next steps be?
Well, we're putting together a website, and that'll identify different sites. And over time, we'll add, as sites come on, we'll add them to the website so they can go back and check. And it's on the study is named the Amelia-1 study. And it is, again, it's this combination with Piqray. So if they go to the site, they'll be able to see, read a little bit more about the drug and see some of the data behind it and the rationale behind it. We talk a little bit about what would be expected of the patient. We show where the sites are, and there'll be links on the website where they can directly contact the different sites, and if it's geographically close. And right now we're talking about being in New England, in New York, down in Florida, out in California, a couple locations out in California. We're looking at sites in the Midwest. We're really trying to basically, circle the country.
That's fantastic. I am so excited for this study and the outstanding work that you guys are doing. Have we forgotten anything? What else do we need to mention?
I think the big takeaways are insulin is not your friend. Eating foods that are high glycemic index, so that would be fruit juice, for example, not a good idea. Eat the fruit, don't drink the juice. And we sort of practice what we preach here with the insulin. So we've gone keto. We've tried it. We did it for quite a long time. It's a tough diet to stay on for any length of time. But we try and watch the carbohydrate intake because we know that causes an insulin spike. And insulin is just not a good player. And the older you get, the worse it is. So insulin is not a good player. Diet and exercise are very, very important. Anything that is low carb is going to be helpful. Lots and lots of vegetables, broccoli, the dark green ones are the best. Our trials, so the Amelia-1 study, and then the study with Dr. Iyengar over at Memorial Sloan Kettering for triple-negative breast cancer patients. So the Piqray study is the one we're running. That's the Amelia-1 study. And then Dr. Iyengar at MSK is doing the triple-negative breast cancer study. And both are with patients that have baseline metabolic issues.
Right. And I'll add one more thing, and that is, we mentioned it earlier, but we did put together a website called metaboloncology.com. So it's really designed to be a place for oncologists and pathologists and people in the field to learn more about this intersection of cancer and metabolic dysfunction.
That's wonderful. We talk so much about this idea of shared decision making, right? And where patients are bringing in research papers and poster presentations, and literally in the middle of their appointment will on their phone pull up, other people's websites and everything, because we really want to bring this science and this information to also our oncologists who may or may not be aware of this new field of metabooncology. And so, I think this is another great way of getting the information out there. And, we're fortunate being in Boston and having access to some of the best medical institutions in the world. You were mentioning New York, California, but I'm also thinking about some of those community hospitals where there might not be an oncologist who specializes specifically in breast health and breast oncology. And so when the patients can feel empowered to bring these materials to their doctors, we're disseminating that information in a variety of ways as well. So I really appreciate that. Well, this has been such a pleasure. I am so excited about all of this information. I know I'll definitely have to listen to this again for it to sink in because it was so rich and in depth. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to be on our podcast and share this great information and resources for our listeners.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're happy to help any way we can.
And thank you all for listening and tuning in week after week here on Breast Cancer Conversations. Please be mindful that all of our content and information is for educational purposes only and is never a substitute for medical advice. If you want to hang out, again, please check out survivingbreastcancer.org/events, where you can RSVP to our Thursday Night Thrivers weekly meetup, our Movement Monday classes, workshops, seminars, and so much more. We can also continue the dialogue online via social media. Our Instagram handle is survivingbreastcancer.org, all one word, and you can follow us on Twitter at SBC_ORG. Until next time, keep on thriving.